It's Mrs. McConnell again. My subject for today is Renaissance art, and I have a lot to share in too little time, but I'm still going to take a few moments to show you first some representative examples of medieval art, and then some examples of art from the earlier classical period of ancient Greece and Rome. I'm deliberately showing these works out of order so you can see first what the Renaissance artists were in part rebelling against, and then what they were trying to imitate and even go beyond. I just saw this work a few days ago, by the way, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Medieval Museum, the Cloisters. It is exquisite, especially in person, and it's a true work of art. The Renaissance artists may have dismissed the medieval period as second-rate. Art historians do not. Still, there's no doubt that the subject matter is mythical, that the garden is symbolic rather than realistic, and that we get very little sense of real space. This sculpture stood over the door to a medieval cathedral. It depicts souls being weighed on the judgment day to determine whether they get to head up to heaven or down to hell. Again, I find this wonderful art, but for now I'll just point out that the figures are unnaturally contorted and disproportionate, and that the sculpture does not give us much sense of where these figures belong in any kind of real space. Notice too that this is relief sculpture. You don't see the figures all the way around. These are pages from the Irish medieval book of Kells. They're likewise stunningly intricate and beautiful, but also quite deliberately moved from the real world. This is art that is symbolic, otherworldly. What's wrong with this picture? Well, I doubt that all those heavily armored knights would be gathering in battle tents to defend a toy castle. The perspective is all off, and the drawing likewise has no depth. Again, we can't really tell where the figures in the painting exist in any kind of real space. This is St. Francis of Assisi with some of the details blown up for you. The painting is very flat and stiff, and the size of the people in the buildings again is all out of whack. Above all, this painting is all about symbols, about faith, about a religious message. It doesn't really capture St. Francis as a man, nor does it capture the nature that he so dearly loved. Here we see St. Francis again in the painting on the left, and this is a painting that brings us much closer to the Renaissance. Indeed, the painter Giotto is often described as proto-Renaissance, sometimes even as the first Renaissance painter. So what differences do you notice between the two depictions of St. Francis? Well, I would say that Giotto's St. Francis is a person, not just a symbol. He exists in space, although not still a completely natural space. The people in this painting are actually interacting, and the story altogether has more dynamism, which you might call humanism. Here is another transitional painting. This Madonna, while stunningly beautiful, is hardly realistic. And in fact is very stylized in the depiction, particularly the face and the nose. Note also that Mary is much larger than the figures around her. Jesus is not really a baby. He's a miniature adult. On the other hand, the throne begins to hint at real space, and the faces are more individual. So, here's a quick summary. And a review of any points that you haven't already captured on the slide. So medieval art has disproportionate figures. It tends to be two-dimensional. You don't see real perspective or a sense of space. The faces are stylized rather than individual. Symbolism is emphasized over realism, and most of the themes are religious. They do not glorify individuals or their earthly accomplishments. And now we move backward in time. This Greek sculpture, made of cast bronze, by the way, was made almost 1,000 years earlier than the works we just saw. So what differences do you notice? Well, this is entirely three-dimensional. Most medieval sculpture, as I mentioned, was relief sculpture, not sculpture in the round. And this, of course, is going to be a more realistic portrayal of the human body. The face in this is still rather stylized. This is something that changes throughout Greek sculpture. Still, it is more individualistic and realistic. And as for the body, well, this guy is used as gym membership more than St. Francis appears to have. Here's another very famous Greek statue that deeply influenced Renaissance artists, juxtaposed with medieval statues outside a cathedral. On the outside of a cathedral, I should say. What differences do you notice? And yes, one of them should be very obvious. Okay, our Greek dude has left his clothes in the locker room, but he's also captured in motion, coiled and ready to throw. The medieval statues are much more static and unmoving. Again, compare this admittedly headless Greek goddess on the left with the medieval queen on the right. You see more naturalism and more movement. And these Roman portrait busts are downright realistic, even unflattering. Finally, notice how this portrait of Caesar Augustus glorifies an individual in a way that medieval sculptors might very well have found idolatrous. Today, art historians are much more inclined to admire medieval art and to accept it on its own terms. But this brief introduction to ancient and medieval art should give you some idea of why Renaissance artists and thinkers were so willing to embrace the realism of classical artists and their recognition of human beauty and power. We're going to explore the characteristics of Renaissance art in just a few minutes, but first, here's an introduction from quite possibly my favorite art historian, a British nun, Sister Wendy Beckett.